Hi everyone, and welcome to week 3. And in this week we're going to be talking about some of the historical roots and how those are affecting contemporary situations and what life looks like now. And what we find really is that what's happened in history has a strong role in shaping policies, regulations, assumptions about the present. So we do have some things on our agenda this week. We have, of course, our weekly quiz. Make sure that's on your schedule and that you are thinking about the quiz throughout the week as you're doing the readings. I'd also like you to make sure you're engaging in your group discussion, and each group does have a discussion board section that's just for them, where they can talk about the assigned questions and even other questions if you have questions about other of the class readings. And then finally, we're going to have our discussion now of related historical policies that are related to the class readings. So we have the readings that we're talking about, and then historical policies that are related to those to really enhance those. You'll see that the first part of our PowerPoints this week has a lot of audio slides. By the time we get to the end, there are not as many audio slides because it really gets somewhat difficult to download. But make sure you're reading through all of the slides and reviewing all of the materials. So let's start with some of the information related to Matthew Snip's article. And in this reading, he's discussing what has happened to Native Americans or American Indians in the United States. We know historically there were a lot of indigenous peoples within the United States before first contact with Europe. And then it was dramatically decreased because of exposure to disease and exposure to negative social policies such as those outlined in Snip's article. Things like the Cherokee Trail of Tears and being taken away from their homes. And it went down from 2.1 to approximately 250,000 American Indians. And then by the time you get to 2010, we do have an increase again. Over 4 million people are American Indians in the United States now. Now, this is, of course, a small portion of the United States population. This picture, known as American Progress, really demonstrates this idea of manifest destiny and westward expansion. What you see here is on the right-hand side, it's a lot lighter than on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, it seems to have progress and civilization. And those on the darker side, the left-hand side, are being pushed outward and pushed away as the angel moves through the sky. So, of course, those that are on the darker side, being that this is done by a Caucasian person in 1872, those are going to be the American Indians. They were seen as not progressive. They were seen as savages. And it's with the woman, the female angel here, coming with the 3 G's: God, guns, and glory, or gold. The glory and gold have been both used. Those were the 3 G's of manifest destiny. That idea that we should settle this land, that it has been given to us. It is our destiny. So if you haven't already done so, please go ahead and do what I asked to do on the previous slide of identifying what was involved in each of those historical eras. And then after you do that, you can look here at this map about what happened with American Indian removal in the 19th century. So this map is really interesting because it demonstrates where people moved from and how they shifted locations. And here we've got a fascinating slide of young children as they are put into an Indian school, Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania. And you have a picture on the top of their first day of school and the picture on the bottom of just a few months later. So they have been told to sit differently and stand differently. They have been told to dress differently. Their hair is different. They've been told to assimilate into more Western and more white norms. Oftentimes for kids, this meant that they weren't allowed to speak their traditional language. if they had writing, to write in their traditional language, that they were expected to adopt the religion, the norms, the language, and the values of those who were the settlers in the area. Now, the previous slide demonstrates within the 1930s the Indian Reorganization Act with Franklin Roosevelt. And then here in the 1950s, they have termination. So that was more of a respect towards American Indians. And then you get to the 1950s where attitudes and politics change, as they always seem to. And the policies now become about termination of the tribal lands and of the tribes themselves, and relocation. So here we have an advertisement that's trying to promote to people the desire and coming to a city, the chance of a lifetime, that you can go to Denver or another big metropolitan area and have a different, more civilized kind of life. And then you'll see on the next slide we have a Self-Determination Act of 1975, complete with Richard Nixon, the former president there, where the attitudes and political feelings had shifted once again, where Indian tribes were seen as being able to have self-determinations and more sovereignty. So what do the lives of American Indians look like now? We know a few things. We know that there's approximately 4 million based on that 2010 census. We also can tell from different kinds of census figures and data where they live. Approximately 46% are living in an urban area, and a little more than half are living in rural areas. So some of those desires for people to relocate to the cities did indeed work. What you see happening oftentimes is that in the rural areas, depending upon what the rural area is, there's not very many jobs. There's not much industry. And it can be difficult for people to make a living. So sometimes what will happen is people who are young adults, they might go to the cities for living for a year, 10 years, 15 years, and their children might be raised by the grandparents back on the reservation area or in a more rural traditional area. Now we're going to adjust a little bit and talk about eugenics, which is another circumstance that looks at the historical context and the historical policies and how they continue to shape present-day realities, and how they've done so over 100 years. So with eugenics, what we have is Charles Darwin. In 1859, he writes on the origin of the species, and you might remember this from some of your biology classes about evolution and how animals evolve, and he specifically started his theory with looking at fruit flies. Now, he had a cousin who was a dilettante, who, kind of would try this and try that. And he became interested in applying this evolution theory to human populations. If it is true for fruit flies that they can adapt and change to their environment over generations, but fruit flies' lives are so short that you can see many generations, perhaps that could be true with human beings as well. And eugenics gained widespread popularity around 1900. Eugenics became popular, and as it did so, and it was seen in the mainstream amongst people, there was two kind of sets of eugenics. There was positive and negative. And positive eugenics was the idea of getting those who were considered superior to breed more and have better children. And that if you were particularly gifted, the Catholic Church, for instance, was encouraged to let particularly gifted priests marry, and thus to allow their spawn and their offspring to have better marriages themselves, and then to promote a superior breed of people. At the same time, negative eugenics were trying to get inferior people to breed less. That is, they wanted to take away charity to dissuade the birth rate, to encourage marriage restrictions. So if you were a member of a group that was considered lesser or not as good, you wouldn't be allowed to marry someone else of another group. Or if you were somebody who was of a high group, you wouldn't be allowed to marry someone else. And to encourage sterilization as well. So of course no one wants to be inferior, but how would you know if you were? It could be if you were someone who was suffering from lunacy, which we might now think of as a kind of mental health condition. From feeble-mindedness, that is, not being as smart as you could be considered that way. From habitual criminality, being a criminal, or pauperism, being poor. All of those things were considered to be biological in nature rather than social, and that if you could eliminate those people from the population, we could get rid of those conditions altogether. But because you guys are social science majors, primarily human development majors, are there non-biological explanations that you could offer to explain these characteristics? For instance, if we just take habitual criminality, well, if you're a member of a group that hasn't been permitted to work in the workforce, you might need to go and get diapers. You might need to go and steal food in order to eat. So your criminality can be explained by historical discrimination. If you're considered not very smart, i.e. feeble-minded, it might be because you weren't allowed to get an education. Women and people of color oftentimes were not allowed to be educated. They weren't encouraged to go to school or to learn to read. And this certainly is going to lead to the idea that you may be feeble-minded. So as people became worried about immigration, as people became worried about those people coming in here and destroying somehow what is supposed to be pure in here, whatever the here is, or whatever the here is to be considered, right? If it's a geographic location or something else. So what we see is that there's a significance of racial taxonomies that place whites and Europeans at the apex of civilization, the highest place, and those who are people of color on the bottom rungs, and everyone else as hybrid or a mongrel. This is from a reading that you actually are not reading. It's from a book called Eugenic Nation, which is a really fascinating read about the history of eugenics within the United States. And on the next slide, you can kind of see how that was physically pictured with the white people at the top. It's a historical picture, and those who were people of color, more and more dark as you go down to the bottom. So that's kind of a demonstration of what a racial taxonomy might be exemplified as with an illustration. The following slides have some really interesting images that come from early 20th century state fairs. And you'll see things such as the Triangle of Life, a medal that you could win if you were to be deemed of having a goodly heritage, if you were the fit and eugenically positive. A picture of a couple that won a Golden Cup for having the best eugenics. And what could happen if you are to breed those who were feeble-minded with those who were normal, which is in a couple of slides down here at slide number 36. And it looks at what will happen if you even have one feeble-minded person introduced into your lineage and what would happen to future generations. So not only did eugenics think that the genes of people were inferior or superior because of those characteristics like being poor or feeble-minded, etc. They also thought that the brain size helped to determine how smart you could be. and not just your brain, but really your skull size. So craniometry was a 19th century pseudoscience that promoted the idea that white people's skulls were on average much larger capacity than those who were people of color, such as American Indians or African Americans. And one of the things that they did to try and prove this was they would take a human skull and empty out what was inside of it, the brains after a person had passed away, and then they would fill it with something like gunshot powder, and then they would measure how much powder. They would pour it in, shift it around, and then pour it back out and measure how much could go into the skull. And they would look at people of different races with the assumption that those who had larger skull capacities were smarter. That was the idea and the theory behind it. What happened, though, was that with some skulls, they would put a lot in and they would cram that gunpowder down. So it would have a lot of information. With others, or a lot of capacity. With others, they wouldn't cram it as much. They wouldn't shove that gunpowder down. So despite the fact that, well, that skull size is not related to how smart someone is, and we know that in the 21st century, they were still able to verify, supposedly, their racist assumptions by this pseudoscience of demonstrating how much could be shoved into that brain. I know many of these images are really troubling to see. So what you've got are things like African Americans assuming that they enjoy watermelon more than anything and saying that you can plainly see how miserable I am. You have on the book Native Son this kind of pulp cover for it where the African American man is glowing and seems somewhat savage compared to the totally covered Caucasian woman. You have D.W. Griffith's The Birth of a Nation, which is a movie, the first feature-length film, so it's still shown oftentimes in film history classes, that celebrated the KKK and the rise of the KKK, and it actually led to the new popularization in the 19-teens of the KKK, which had kind of faded away. And we end up here with lynching, the strange fruit. All of racist images help to make this assumption that African Americans are other, are not as good, are not to be considered as human, and not to be treated the same. This is if we're talking about roots and fruits, this is the fruits of eugenicism. Now, the eugenics movement died in popularity in the 1940s after concentration camps were revealed with World War II. But racial discrimination continued, and so thus we have the differential treatment of people, which ends up with the treatment of people like this, which ends up with lynchings.